Okay, so our next section is on the Mosaic era, and this covers Exodus through Deuteronomy and, of course, Psalm 90, which is the Mosaic Psalm. The form of revelation in this period includes theophanies, oracles. These are more than law, they're messages from God. Now, for example, God tells Moses about the golden calf, but God also gives oracles to Balaam, who's a rather controversial figure. We have written law, of course. The law code is handed down to Moses, and he's commanded to write all of the things that are added there apart from what was just in the Ten Commandments. We have miracles and signs. Of course, we have the 10 plagues against Egypt. We have the parting of the Red Sea. We have the provision of the manna and the quail in the wilderness, the provision of water from the rock. So God reveals himself to be greater than the gods of Egypt in his conquest of the Egyptians. And the miracles are also signs pointing to God's power and to his presence in Israel. Of course, we have the writings of Moses. They're a revelation of God to the Israelites through Moses, and further to us through Moses. They're not just a revelation to Moses, but God commands Moses to write the things down, and so it's clear that God intends this revelation to go beyond Moses in the written form, that it gives revelation to that generation, to generations beyond. The structure and the formation of the worship was designed to reveal God. First of all, there's a clear differentiation between the clean and the unclean, and the purpose was to reveal what kind of person was acceptable before God. So God is revealed as the one who won't just accept any old thing, that God is worthy of our best, and God is also holy and separated from sinfulness, and that we must be people who are somehow separated from sin, whether it's something that God does or whether it's something that we make the choices to separate ourselves from. The content of the revelation in this period, there's providential acts which show God's authority and power, even over the elements of nature. The sea's parted by a strong wind, and God has control over the sea. Secondly, there's communication of God through his works, nature, and will. To receive God's communication, we need to walk in the light of his already revealed word. Okay. And there's also revelation of the future in Deuteronomy chapter 17. It speaks about when they enter into the land, the future, about where they're going to live, etc. And it says, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us, be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. So, revelation of the future. And again in chapter 18, the nations you will dispossess, listen to those who practice sorcery or divination, but as for you, the Lord your God has not permitted you to do so. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own brothers. You must listen to him. Okay, so revealing the future. The people who are involved in the Mosaic period, of course, the activity seems to center around Aaron, Moses, and Miriam. God reveals himself to Moses as Yahweh, the I am, the I am who I am. The active presence of God is there with Moses at the burning bush, and the name refers to the active relational presence of God, the covenant relational presence of God. Secondly, he reveals himself as the father of Israel. He's an individual who cares for his children. They are God's people because they are the descendants of the patriarchs, and therefore they are heirs to the covenant relationship. But their thinking at this point is completely dominated by idolatry. God, however, is faithful and has not forgotten the covenant. Okay, when he speaks to Pharaoh, he speaks about his firstborn son. It's a collective singular. Israel is God's firstborn, and if Pharaoh won't let him go, then Pharaoh will forfeit his firstborn, and so will all of Egypt. The firstborn of Egypt are forfeited in exchange for the nation of Israel. God has the right to select and choose whom he will to be his servants, and we have the privilege of actively choosing to participate in his purposes. So God refers to Israel as his children, but he also acts as a father when he takes responsibility for their welfare. He speaks, "Let my people go," with authority. They're his because they're his children. But also this reveals to us that God is the God over the nations as well as Israel. To the Egyptians, Pharaoh is God, but the God of Israel is God of all, and he approves his authority by his destruction of the powers of Egypt. Pharaoh dies. Pharaoh was the firstborn. God commands also the Assyrians, the Syrians, the Babylonians, etc. And later, of course, in history, he deals with individuals like Nebuchadnezzar. So God reveals himself as God over all nations, not just over the nation of Israel. He chooses to reveal himself and bind himself in covenant relationship to the nation of Israel. This is because they're the seed of Abraham. And it's the faith of Abraham that will bring the people out of Egypt, because God announced to Abraham that after the 400 or so years he would bring them out, and Abraham believed. The acts of God come into focus with his dealing with Pharaoh. God acts because of his relationship as father to Israel. Exodus 5:2 shows Pharaoh's attitude to God. He says, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." He reveals his ignorance. He reveals that he doesn't have any kind of relationship with God. Okay. But God's acts prove undoubtedly who God really is. His acts in destroying the power of Egypt. Mordecai gives 4 terms by which Scripture refers to Israel. Of course, there's the Hebrew word Am. It's an ethnic group, okay, with the capable of becoming a whole, a nation, set apart from other nations. They're dependent on God. They are Adonai, the people of the Lord. Secondly, the word that's used is Edah, which means a congregation. It conveys the idea of uniting in worship, and the people of Israel are considered God's congregation. They gather together in unity to worship the God of Israel. Sagolah is the third word that's used. It means a treasured possession. God chose them because he loved them and he called them to himself, and they are his treasure, even when they don't behave. And then the fourth word that is used is the word kadosh, which means holy, which of course means set apart for God's purposes, not pure, not in the sense of righteousness, but separated unto God for his purposes. But each of these descriptions of the people of God depend on God's chesed, his faithfulness, his grace, his loving kindness. They can't live up to these terms that God uses of them without, and so it's God's grace that he gives them these labels. God also does reveal himself as Yahweh. I mean, this is the term that is usually not pronounced. It's the term that God uses to reveal to Moses, "I am that I am," and it reveals that there are no other gods. He's the same God as El Shaddai, who makes the covenant with Abraham, but he's also Yahweh, the covenant-keeping God, who keeps this covenant, and this requires the work of redemption. Redemption of Israel includes the exchange of a price. Actually, Israel, as God's firstborn, is exchanged for Pharaoh's firstborn, in fact. The price is established by the retailer, Once the redemption price is paid, the property reverts to the new owner. However, in this situation, God establishes the price and pays it himself. He does it all, and the slave Israel just has to follow. The whole picture of Calvary is contained in the picture of redemption here. God has done it all, we only have to follow. The covenant makes Israel a peculiar people in the old English sense of that word, a unique and special and different people, a holy nation and a kingdom of priests. And this happens by participating actively, following as God does what is necessary. God does the work. Israel is borne along on the eagle's wings. God brought about the Passover. The people had to obey and put the blood on the doorposts. They had to leave Egypt. They had to step into the opening of the Red Sea, and so on. Simply following. Being a holy nation is not an option. The response is imperative. They must respond. Having partaken in the redemption, they are God's people, and they have no option but to fulfill his program. It's interesting that the scripture does comment that God could have taken them along the seacoast to the land of Israel, but they'd have had to fight the Philistines. But instead, he takes them through the Red Sea, which requires his miraculous intervention. Then the sea closes. There's no way back. They can't go back to be not the people of God. They are stuck on the other side of the Red Sea, and they're in the wilderness, and they must be dependent on God. They can't go back. And so they have to actively participate in the covenant. Komsky gives the following functions of the covenant. First of all, the term berith connotes an oath without any conditions. This is the word that is used for covenant. It's the sovereign God stating something which he will do by his power. The formal work of a covenant is kind of crystallized in a mutual agreement, but God is the one who initiates, who sets down the terms, and who presents the covenant, and the people just agree, but that agreement is binding. Okay, it tells us that this kind of unilateral intent, it comes from God, and it's all initiated by God, and all that's required of the people is response. And that is why their obedience is so necessary, because their unswerving loyalty to God is necessary because of what he's already done. The basic idea underlying the covenant is that of relationship, which involves obligation. You're obliged to obey God because he's taken you as his children. He's become your father. He's done the work that is needed, and you are obliged to respond. And the basis of the covenant is clearly the fact that God chose them to be his people because he loved them. The covenant was not made because of any merit of the individuals involved. In fact, Scripture tells us quite clearly that it wasn't because they were many, because they were few, and it wasn't because they were particularly nice people. It was because God chose, and he chose for his purposes. So as we proceed through the Pentateuch, each of these covenants has something more involved in it. So the characteristics of the Mosaic covenant. Obviously, obedience was required. The obedience was more for the good of the Israelites so that they might experience the blessings of God. God's plan is not to punish us or limit us or make our lives miserable. It is actually that if we will abide by his conditions, we will live our lives in the place where he can bless us. And God's desire is to bless us. And so he gives stipulations for how to live under the blessing of God. What the Israelites didn't seem to realize was that living in the land was contingent upon obedience. If they were obedient to God, then they lived in the land. They never actually owned it. It was God's land, and they were stewards of the land as long as they walked in obedience. But because of disobedience, this negates not just the power of God's blessing, but also the power of salvation and of healing. And the result really comes to us by free choices. Obedience is to make one ready and able to receive the blessings of God, and it's defined in terms of life and good. In Deuteronomy 30:15, it's a matter of choice. Choose today whom you'll serve, Joshua said to his generation. So Torah is much more than law. I mean, we generally talk about it and interpret it in the New Testament often too as law, but it's much more than that. It comes from a root word that means instruction. And so Torah is the instruction that teaches people how to live acceptably before God so that they can be blessed. It was possible to please God if they chose to. If they chose to please God and walk in obedience, they would be blessed. Secondly, loyalty was expected. In Leviticus 20, verses 24 to 26, you see the whole purpose of the clean and unclean instruction was to preserve their holiness, so that they could come into the presence of God with confidence, so that God would hear and respond. And so there was always to be a distinction between what was clean and what was unclean, and that they would separate themselves from the unclean so that they could be ceremonially clean in God's presence. Thirdly, the Mosaic covenant promised that they would be the people of God. They're God's people because of what God has done, and because of the way they're going to live in the world. God intended their relationship with him to be so vibrant that others would look on and say, wow, we want what they've got. That the news would spread to the other nations, and that through that all nations on the earth would be blessed. Faith was required in God's redeeming work. If there's no obedience, there's no faith. So obedience is the outward sign of faith. Okay. And I mean, they had to put the blood on the doorpost of the house in faith that God would protect them and that they would not lose their firstborn. So it's an act of faith. It's interesting, you know, if anybody else living in Egypt, not just the Israelites, but other people, if there were other slaves, for example, or if there were even Egyptians who decided that they might identify with the people of Israel after they'd seen all the other plagues happening, anybody who decided to participate in the Passover and put the blood on the doorposts of the house would have been exempted from the plague of the death of the firstborn. And it does say that they came out of Egypt a mixed multitude, so it seems that it wasn't only Israelites who were protected by the blood on the doorpost, that some others had faith and did what the Israelites did and therefore were exempted. Fifthly, love became an important ingredient. In the word chesed, love and faith cannot be separated. Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 to 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Okay, that love is the important ingredient. The love of God is supposed to actually control their lives, and they should obey out of love, not out of duty. Sixthly, the Mosaic covenant is particular rather than universal. In contrast to the Abrahamic covenant, it is with all Israel and not just one family, because they're all descendants of Abraham, of course. And it includes any who wanted to join themselves to Israel by Passover and circumcision. So the door was always open for people to be included in Israel who were not physical descendants of Abraham, and to be included in the Mosaic covenant. The confirming sign was the redemption God provided for the exodus out of Egypt, but circumcision is also included there. Okay. The seal of the covenant, or its ratification, is the sacrifices that was made and the sprinkling of the blood of the covenant. The blood signifies life, and all who are sprinkled with it are thus included in the covenant. Okay, and it also included the covenant meal, which is referred to in Exodus 24:11. These three things give the people standing before God as a whole, the whole group of people, But each Israelite then also becomes responsible for his own walk before God and his own obedience. Israel was responsible to get rid of any offending influence in the camp. And even though God has grounds for severing his relationship with Israel, he will not. He will remain faithful, even when they mess up and don't fulfill the requirements. And the last thing that we see about the covenant is that it's everlasting. Exodus chapter 12, verse 14 says, "This is the day you are to commemorate for the generations to come. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance." And then in verse 24, "Obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants." So it's to be everlasting. The content of the covenant, we see the tripartite formula that was mentioned before by Kaiser. He will be their God, they will be his people, he will dwell in the midst of them. Knowing that Yahweh is their God is the fundamental core of the covenant. The Hebrew word to know often carries the implication of personal intimacy, personal experience. It's not just knowing about something or knowing facts, it's knowing the person, and that's what's required of them to live in covenant relationship with God, to be an intimate relationship with him. The abiding presence of God was what made the tabernacle holy, and it prevented those who were unprepared from entering. The visible manifestation reminded the people that God was in their midst. There's a continuation of the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant. There's blessing and cursing, obviously, that they're going to be a great nation, a promised seed and land. And because they were a kingdom of priests, the whole nation is seen as having responsibility for mediating the grace of God to the other nations. So the Mosaic covenant was never supposed to be something that cursed people. It was supposed to be provided for their blessing, to keep them in covenant relationship with God. The stipulations didn't make them the people of God. The stipulations kept them the people of God. And so the Mosaic covenant is built on the Abrahamic covenant, of course, that comes to descendants of Abraham. But it has open doors for other people to enter the covenant if they will accept circumcision, if they would participate in the Passover originally in Egypt, but also in future generations if they would be circumcised and participate in the Passover and in the whole ceremonial aspect and the moral law of Israel, then they would come into covenant relationship with God. And that's why we see that people like Ruth and Rahab could be included because of their faith. Okay, so that kind of covers the Mosaic period. We'll talk a little more about the Mosaic law in the next lecture.